Hello, everyone, and welcome to Health Reform Beyond the Basics. Thank you for joining us for our fall series for coverage year 2025. Today's webinar, Immigration-Related Eligibility for Health Coverage Programs, is the first of two webinars in our fall series that will focus on enrollment issues for people who are immigrants. My name is Aizad Oriale, and I'm the Health Projects Assistant at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I'll be moderating today's webinar, which we are presenting in partnership with the National Immigration Law Center. Beyond the Basics is a project of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. It's designed to provide training and resources to facilitate enrollment in the ACA, health insurance marketplaces, and Medicaid. The Center is a nonprofit policy organization. We are not a part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Beyond the Basics is aimed at healthcare assisters, advocates, state and local officials, and others who help people get and keep their health coverage. This session is not intended for press purposes, and we are not able to offer continuing education credit for our webinars at this time. Webinar logistics. Automated captions have been enabled for this webinar. To view them, you can click on the two CC icons at the bottom of your screen, or you can click on the More option with three dots at the bottom of your screen. There you should have the option to turn on closed captioning. All participants are muted and in listen-only mode. If you'd like to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and type your question into the box. We will be monitoring questions and will pause for Q&A during the session. We may not be able to answer every question that is asked, but we will do our best, and we will have a record of all of your questions, which we will use as a guide for future resources and presentations. And of course, you can email your questions after the webinar to beyondthebasics@cbpp.org. And a reminder that you will not be able to click on your screen to go to any of the links shared, but I will place a link to the slide deck in the chat where all active links are. And after today's webinar, we will email a recording of this presentation along with the slides and other resources. Okay, the webinar schedule. So here you can see the webinar schedule for the fall series. We are hosting a combination of traditional webinars as well as these new office hour sessions. For some topics, not a lot has changed since last year. So we're offering office hours to give you a quick refresher and answer your questions. But you can always refer to our webinar archive for in-depth webinars on these topics. And this includes households and income, the premium tax credit, and upcoming sessions, plan design and plan comparison, and the annual re-enrollment process for the marketplace. We're offering full-length webinars on topics where there's new information to share or where we typically get a lot of questions, including eligibility, outreach, and application issues for people who are immigrants, and resolving data matching issues. We're also introducing two new webinars, What's New for 2025, which will be delivered in English and Spanish. And finally, for the first time, we'll be hosting an enrollment trivia challenge to round out the series. This will be a quiz show for both new and seasoned assisters to put your eligibility and enrollment skills to the test. Today's webinar will cover immigration-related eligibility for health coverage programs, other important eligibility rules for families that include immigrants, and options for people ineligible for insurance affordability programs due to immigration status. Today's presenters are Shelby Gonzales, Vice President of Immigration Policy at CBPP, and Gabrielle Lessard from the National Immigration Law Center. Gabrielle specializes in the laws and policies affecting access to healthcare for low-income immigrants and their families. Now I'll turn it over to Gabrielle to get us started.
Thanks, Aizad. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Next slide, please. So there are essentially two broad categories of immigrant eligibility that we're going to talk about today. One is the lawfully present or lawfully residing standard, and then the second is a more restrictive qualified immigrant eligibility standard that is used by Medicaid and CHIP. So people who are qualified immigrants include, in very general terms, lawful permanent residents. We call them LPRs. They're often referred to as people who have green cards, as well as people who are admitted to the country for various humanitarian or other specific reasons, including refugees and asylees, certain people from Cuba and Haiti, people who are admitted for humanitarian purposes through a process called parole that has nothing to do with criminal parole, people who are granted withholding of their deportation or removal because it's not safe to return to their home country. Certain people who are survivors of domestic violence, including their child or parent, as well as survivors of human trafficking, as well as their immediate family members. People from certain Pacific Island nations, such as the Marshall Islands and Palau, which nations are members of something called the Compact of Free Association with the United States, and then people from Iraq and Afghanistan who have or are in the process of applying for special immigrant visas granted to people that helped our military in their countries. Also not qualified, not a qualified immigrant, but eligible is a person who is a member of a federally recognized Indian tribe or an American Indian who is born in Canada. Next slide. Now, even if they have qualified immigrant status, many people have to wait 5 years after attaining that status before they're eligible for benefit programs like Medicaid. So most of the people affected by this are lawful permanent residents, and there are a number of exceptions. So people who are not subject to the 5-year bar are humanitarian immigrants who have refugee, asylee, or status or withholding of removal, people who are one of the Cuban Haitian entrance statuses, people who are LPRs who have credit for 10 years of work in the United States, and that's something that people can get through a spouse or parent under some circumstances. People who are applying for or who have that special immigrant visa, people from Afghanistan or the Ukraine who were paroled into the United States during certain date ranges on the bottom of the slides, survivors of human trafficking, COFA migrants, and then immigrants who are US veterans or on active military duty, as well as their spouses and children under age 21. People who were in the US before the date in 1996 when the law that created the distinction went into effect. And then at state option, children and people who are pregnant who are lawfully residing. And we'll talk about that in more detail in forthcoming slides. Next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, states have some flexibility to cover lawfully residing children and pregnant women, pregnant people. So this is an option that was created within the CHIP program, but it applies to Medicaid as well. And states can cover children or pregnant individuals who are lawfully residing in the US. So who are part of a larger group of immigrants that includes that qualified immigration status as well as other people who are lawfully residing. They get federal participation in the funding. And again, this is without a 5-year bar. So this is a popular option. 37 states have taken it up for children and 31 for pregnant individuals. And then in addition to this option, there's an option under CHIP that allows states to provide prenatal care to pregnant people regardless of their immigration status. And then beyond these options that have federal financial participation, a number of states, a growing number of states really, have opted to use their own funds to cover people who don't meet the restrictive immigration related federal eligibility standards. Next slide. I think we go back one. Thank you. Okay, so the lawfully residing statuses, again, the ones that meet the Medicaid standard are qualified immigrants, and those are lawful permanent residents, a number of humanitarian immigrants, and then some other people from specific countries, including the Cuban Haitian entrants, people who are from the Compact of Free Association countries, and people who qualify for those Iraqi or Afghani special immigrant visas, and then as well as the American Indians born in Canada. So some of the other lawfully residing statuses are people who are granted relief under the Convention Against Torture, people who have temporary protected status or deferred enforced departure. These are similar statuses that are granted to people who are in the United States when something happens in their country that makes it unsafe for them to return. People who have deferred action, which is an administrative form of relief, except for DACA recipients currently, people who are paroled in, but for less than a year, and people with non-immigrant status, which includes people on worker visas like H-2A, people with student visas, U visas for victims of crime, and many others. People who have an administrative order staying their removal or deportation. And then a couple of older statuses are lawful temporary resident and family unity. And those came out of some different immigration reforms over the years. One thing that we wanted to highlight is that since 2012, people who were granted deferred action under DACA have not been eligible for Medicaid CHIP or the Affordable Care Act. And we'll talk about some regulations that are pending implementation that will change that. Next slide. So in addition to people that have statuses, people who are applying for certain statuses are also considered lawfully present or lawfully residing. I should note that lawfully residing means they are lawfully present for immigration purposes and residents of the state for Medicaid or CHIP purposes. So these statuses include lawful permanent resident, people applying for lawful permanent resident status who have an approved visa petition, people applying for special immigrant juvenile status, which is a status granted to kids who have had to seek the protection of the juvenile courts because of a parent's mistreatment, and then people who are applying for trafficking visas. A number of the categories of applicants who are eligible are only eligible if they also have employment authorization. So that includes applicants for temporary protected status, registry we haven't talked about yet. People who have been in the US for a long period of time can actually just register and become lawful permanent residents. The registry date currently is January 1st, 1972, and there are some active campaigns to move that up. People with an order of supervision, that's generally where they can't go back to their home country because we don't have diplomatic relations or something. Applicants for cancellation of removal or suspension of deportation. People applying for legalization under the 1986 immigration reform called IRCA, we're unlikely to see those now. Applicants for LPR under the Life Act, that is also something that would be unlikely for you to see since it's an older status. And then applicants for asylum, if they are over age 14, they need to have employment authorization. If they are under age 14, they need to have had their application pending for 180 days. And then the same is true for people who are applying for withholding of deportation or removal, or people applying for relief under the Convention Against Torture. Next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are some regulations that have been published as final regulations, but are not yet effective. So these regulations were published in May, and they become effective November 1st. They affect the ACA marketplace as well as basic health plan eligibility. They do not apply to the lawfully residing standards under Medicaid and CHIP. So under these regulations, people who were granted deferred action under DACA will no longer be barred from purchasing coverage and receiving subsidies on the ACA marketplaces. And then there are also a number of simplification and clarifications in the eligibility standards for some statuses that are already listed as lawfully present. So that includes the correction of an oversight, essentially, that the regulations say people applying for special immigrant juvenile status are eligible, but omitting the fact that people who are granted that status remain lawfully present. And then vulnerable children under age 14 who are applying for asylum, withholding of removal, or relief under the Convention Against Torture will no longer be required to wait 180 days to apply for health coverage. The non-immigrant visa holders, the current regulations indicate that it's only people who are not in violation of their status. That's not really something healthcare enrollers are qualified to determine, and the regulations recognize that by removing that requirement. There were a couple of categories of people with employment authorization documents who were not included as lawfully present, and the regulations eliminate those exceptions so that everybody with employment authorizations is recognized as lawfully present. And then people who are applying for adjustment to lawful permanent resident status will no longer be required to have an approved visa petition, which is something that wasn't actually available in all cases. And then again, I want to repeat, these are for the marketplace and basic health plan in the states that have it, but it does not affect the lawfully residing definition for Medicaid and CHIP. Next slide. So if we look at these lawfully present statuses after the regulations go into effect, again, all of the qualified immigrants will essentially be the same. And then other lawfully present statuses will be people granted relief under the Convention Against Torture, people granted temporary protected status, deferred enforced departure, deferred action, including DACA, people paroled in to the US for less than 1 year, people with non-immigrant status. Important to note that people still need to be able to establish residency for the ACA. So some people with visas that are short-term visitors visas, for example, will still not be eligible. And then administrative order staying removal hasn't changed. Lawful temporary resident, family unity, those are older statuses. People granted special immigrant juvenile status in that important clarification, and then other people who have been granted employment authorization. So this will be much more straightforward and streamlined once it's fully rolled out. Next slide. And then also under the November 1st changes, people applying for lawful permanent resident status, again, eliminating that requirement for an approved visa petition, people applying for special immigrant juvenile status, trafficking visas, withholding of removal. Sorry, it should be, okay, sorry, I'm getting messed up. People applying for withholding of deportation or removal, and people applying for relief under the Convention Against Torture. And then if they are 14 or over, they also must have employment authorization if they're applying for TPS, registry, and order of supervision, cancellation of removal or suspension of deportation, for legalization under IRCA, or applying for LPR under the Life Act. IRCA and Life Act are older laws that you probably won't see many of those people, as well as people applying for asylum. So next slide. Okay, so people who are newly eligible because of the new the regulations in states that don't begin their open enrollment November 1st will be eligible for a special enrollment period beginning November 1st. And if they opt to enroll early in that period, they could begin coverage as soon as December 1st. While the regulations, as a proposed rule, would also have modified the Medicaid and CHIP lawfully residing status standard. That change has not been implemented at this point in time. People who meet the lawfully present status, but they are not qualified immigrants and therefore are not eligible for Medicaid due to their immigration status, can generally go to the marketplace and qualify for financial assistance, paying for their premiums and possibly out-of-pocket costs, even if their income is below 100% of the poverty line. And then just, a note that every time something changes, there is a little bit of a transition period. And so we may encounter some bumps in the road as the change is implemented. People want to ensure that they fill out the ERA application as completely and accurately as possible. They may get a data mastering issue off their immigration status. For example, if the systems haven't been updated, and then you want to upload the required documentation as quickly as possible if you're assisting that person. People who have data matching issues might get the wrong eligibility result for their APTCs, or they might be incorrectly sent to Medicaid. So, keep your eyes out for that and try to help them resolve those data matching issues. And we will be going into more detail about navigating those on our next webinar, September 21st, 24th, as well as the October 1st webinar. So at this point, I think I turn it over to Shelby.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle, and everyone and the Beyond the Basics team. I'm always excited about joining this webinar series each year. And I thank all of you out there who are doing such great work to help people get enrolled in health coverage. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples that try to kind of illustrate the very complex eligibility rules that Gabrielle just went through. So next slide, please. I'm going to start with an example of a family. Ricky and Ava are married and they have a daughter, Karina, and Ricky has temporary protected status. Ava has deferred action for childhood arrivals, and Karina is has U.S. citizenship. So in this scenario, we'll have all the family applying for insurance. Next slide, please. So if we're only looking at eligibility based off of citizenship and immigration status rules under today's eligibility requirements. So today, okay? Ricky is applying for coverage. He's not a citizen. He has temporary protected status. That is not a qualified immigrant status. So, so that is not applicable. Nor is the 5-year bar, right? Because he doesn't even meet that kind of first requirement. So temporary protected status is a lawfully present status, lawfully residing status. So because of that, he may be eligible for marketplace coverage based off of his immigration status. Next, we're going to look at Ava, and Ava is applying for coverage. She's not a U.S. citizen. Her immigration status is DACA. She's not a qualified immigrant. So again, the 5-year bar is not relevant to her. Does she have a lawfully residing or lawfully present immigration status? No, she does not today. Okay. Next, we're going to have, so that means she's not eligible for marketplace coverage or for any Medicaid or CHIP coverage either. Next, we're going to look at Karina, and Karina is applying for coverage. She is a U.S. citizen. So the immigration related questions are not relevant to her. She meets the eligibility requirements based off of immigration status for Medicaid and CHIP, and she also meets it for marketplace coverage. Next slide, please. Next, we want to just look at how this is going to change, how things will change as of November 1st for this family. The big change, as Gabrielle talked about, is that the ACA marketplace coverage now will, has ended the bar on eligibility for people with DACA. So, Ricky, that's not relevant to Ricky. It's not relevant to Karina. it's only relevant to Ava, who has DACA status and is now going to see a change in her eligibility. She's now going to be eligible based off of her immigration status for marketplace coverage. I want to note that there is a typo on this slide where it says lawfully residing / lawfully present under Ava's status. It should just say lawfully present at this point, because one big thing that has changed in the past, lawfully residing and lawfully present were the same in terms of which statuses would qualify somebody to be eligible. And now there's a departure because we have, one, now, as Gabrielle went through, we had one chart for lawfully present and one chart of who's eligible for lawfully residing. So that's going to take some getting used to, including for us who we, forgot to do this little change here on this slide. But we'll change it on the ones that get posted to the website later on. Next slide, please. Other important eligibility rules for families that include immigrants. These are rules that kind of come up a lot and that are tricky for a lot of people. So the next slide. This one is the one that I get asked so many questions about on a regular basis. So for premium tax credit eligibility, in general, you must have income at or above 100% of the federal poverty line. That's generally something that must happen. So you can't, if your income is at 99% of the federal poverty line, that means you would normally not be eligible for premium tax credits. And there is an exception to this rule, and that exception is for people who have a lawfully present immigration status, so they're eligible to purchase insurance in the marketplace, but they're not eligible for Medicaid due to their immigration status. And remember how Gabrielle talked about Medicaid has a more restrictive standard of eligibility for immigrate based off of immigration status. So when the ACA was being created, the idea was that everybody would have an affordable pathway to a health coverage, and that would normally be either under Medicaid or in the marketplace. Because the writers of the ACA did not want to expand eligibility for people who are immigrants in Medicaid, they had to find a pathway so that people could still get coverage that was affordable that they could purchase in the marketplace. So that's why there is this rule that allows for people who do not meet the immigration-related requirement to enroll in Medicaid, but do meet the immigration-related requirement in the ACA marketplaces to still be able to qualify for premium tax credits, even if their income is below the poverty line. So this includes people who have a lawfully present status that either maybe their status is not a qualified immigration status. So for example, somebody with temporary protected status, that's a status that you may run into quite a bit. That is a status that's lawfully present, meets that status, but it's not going to meet the requirement for qualified immigration status under Medicaid. A new one, right, would be another example with people with deferred action for childhood arrivals. That group does not meet the qualified immigration status, but does meet the lawfully present status requirement under the ACA. So that's one way. It's that you just don't have a status that fits within that very narrow restrictive group under Medicaid. The other way is that you might be subject to, so you might have a qualified immigration status, like perhaps you have lawful permanent resident status. That's the big group that you would see this happen to. But that person may have not had that status for 5 years yet. And there's a 5-year wait for people to enroll in Medicaid and CHIP under, most circumstances without, unless there was some kind of exception, right? And lawful permanent residents are one of those groups, big group, that is subject to 5-year waiting period. So that would be another example. So the bottom line is that many people who have a lawfully present status and incomes that are either in the Medicaid range or below 100% of the federal poverty line are eligible for premium tax credits and cost sharing reductions in the marketplace. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through an example of this because this is, again, one of those policies that I get so many questions about every year. And it's not a surprise to me because it is so counterintuitive and confusing. And it really requires like a lot of knowledge of different benefit programs to really put the pieces together to be able to really fully understand why things work out this way. And eligibility seems to be a little different than what you would expect. So in this case, we have Gina and Adnan who are married and have a son named Sam. And Gina has had her lawful permanent resident status for 2 years. Adnan entered the U.S. as a refugee, and Sam has U.S. citizenship. And we're going to say that Sam already has Medicaid coverage. So in this case, we're only going to be looking at Gina and Adnan's eligibility. So from an income perspective, both Gina and Adnan are full-time college students and they both work part-time jobs. They project that their income will be $23,238 for 2025, which puts them at about 90% of the federal poverty line. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to look at eligibility for Adnan and Gina just based off of their status, okay? So Adnan is applying for coverage. He's not a U.S. citizen. He has refugee status. That is a qualified immigrant status, yes. It's a status that is not subject to the 5-year wait. So he is lawfully, and he is also lawfully, he would meet the lawfully residing and lawfully present standards. So that means he meets the requirement based off of citizenship or immigration status for enrollment in Medicaid and in marketplace coverage. For Gina, she's applying for coverage. She's not a U.S. citizen. She has lawful permanent resident status. That is a qualified immigrant status. She's subject to the 5-year bar. She has not met the 5-year bar. She's only been here for 2 years. So that means that and she's also lawfully present, right? So that means that she may qualify for marketplace coverage based off of what we know so far. Next slide, please. So in a state that has expanded Medicaid, how will this play out, right? Remembering that their income is at 90% of the federal poverty line. So Adnan has refugee status. He would qualify for Medicaid based off of having a qualified immigration status that's not subject to the 5-year bar, and his income's below 138% of the federal poverty line because, again, this is a state that's expanded Medicaid. Gina has had her lawful permanent resident status for 2 years. Her income is 90% of the federal poverty line. She's eligible for enrollment in marketplace coverage with PTCs because she has a lawfully present immigration status, but she's ineligible for Medicaid due to her immigration status, right? So she's not eligible for the Medicaid or CHIP side of things, but she would qualify for subsidized marketplace coverage. Next slide, please. This looks very different when you're in a state that has not expanded Medicaid, right? Now, Adnan has refugee status. His income is at 90% of the federal poverty line. He's ineligible because his state did not expand Medicaid, right? He's ineligible for PTCs in the marketplace because his income is below 100% of the federal poverty line, okay? There's no exception that applies to him. He's fully eligible for Medicaid based on immigration status. Gina has had her LPR status for 2 years. Her income is at 90% of the federal poverty line. She's eligible for enrollment in marketplace coverage with PTCs. Nothing really has changed for her in this scenario. She is lawfully present. but she's ineligible for Medicaid due to her immigration status. So you can see how this can play out very differently depending on whether your state has opted to expand Medicaid or not. Next slide, please. Another special marketplace rule for older adults. So older adults who are not eligible for premium-free Medicare Part A may be eligible for enrollment in marketplace plans and for premium tax credits and cost sharing reductions. To qualify for premium-free Medicare Part A, individuals must have met some kind of the applicable work history requirement. And this is a measure based off of if you've paid into Social Security, right? So you've got quarters of earnings that are applicable to you. And oftentimes that means you have worked and paid into Social Security. In some cases, you're able to get the credits based off of the work history of your spouse. It is really important to know that to the extent somebody is planning to enroll in Medicare at some point, they really should pay really close attention to deadlines, because fees that are associated for non-enrolling by certain deadlines are really steep and they're forever. They're forever. So it's tricky, right? It's tricky to really counsel somebody through this or help them navigate through this decision. But oftentimes it is much more of a straightforward example, the examples that have come to us. Oftentimes, it's the story of my father has been waiting to get his lawful permanent resident status for 5 years, back in Peru. And, finally he's coming over here. He's 80 years old, he's never worked in the US. This is a case that's pretty straightforward, right? He's not going to be able to likely get a sufficient number of quarters of Social Security credits for earnings. That's a pretty straightforward example. It could be less straightforward, right? It could be somebody who has some of the work history and not all, and it's unclear how long they're gonna be working. So it's important to think through this pretty carefully. Also important to note that people of any age who are claimed as dependents cannot apply for premium tax credits individually. The tax filer who claims them must also claim the premium tax credit on their behalf. We're going to go through an example. Next slide, please. So in this case, we have Lynn, who's 74 and lives with his daughter May and grandson Michael. And Lynn has had a lawful permanent resident status for 4 years. He has never worked in the U.S. He receives $2,500 a year from a pension for work that he completed abroad. He is not enrolled in Medicare Part A. May provides more than 50% of Lynn's support. She claims Lynn and Michael as tax dependents, and her household income is $51,640 a year, which is at 200% of the federal poverty line. So Lynn is eligible for marketplace coverage. Lynn is eligible to enroll in a marketplace plan with subsidies, even though he's over 65. He's not eligible for premium-free Medicare Part A based off his work history. Next slide, please. If a person can be claimed as a tax dependent, they must indicate that when applying for a premium tax credit. So can Lynn apply on his own for a premium tax credit? Well, Lynn qualifies as May's tax dependent, right? Lynn lives with May and is also her relative. May pays for more than half of his support. Lynn's gross income is less than $1,050 a year. Lynn is May's tax dependent, so he cannot apply for PTC on his own as a household of one. He may be eligible for PTC, but he must include May and her income on his application for health coverage. Important, if Lynn receives a PTC, must file a tax return and reconcile his PTC on her tax return, just like everybody else that gets a PTC. That PTC must be reconciled. Next slide, please. State residency for Marketplace, Medicaid, and CHIP. So this comes up a lot as well. So in general, for ACA Marketplace and Medicaid and CHIP, residency is a state in which an individual lives and intends to reside, including without a fixed address, or has entered with a job commitment or seeking employment, whether or not that person is currently employed. To verify residency, states and marketplaces can accept self-attestation. They can also use HHS approved electronic sources to the extent that they exist. They can't use evidence of immigration status. So that should not be something that people are asked to produce, and specifically to identify whether or not somebody meets a state residency requirement. Next slide, please. PTC related rules for married people who have non-resident status. So a general rule, right, to qualify for premium tax credits is that somebody that is married must file taxes jointly with their spouse. That's a general rule that applies to everyone. There are certain people who are immigrants that file their taxes on Form 1040 NR. And some people who have non-immigrant visas, so for example, some students, some other visas, they must file on a Form 1040 NR because they can't meet the substantial presence test in their first 5 years in the US. Okay, so they have to use this form. And Form 1040 NR doesn't allow most people who are married and have non-resident immigration status to file jointly with a spouse. So they can't meet the joint filing requirement to claim a PTC. There are some exceptions based off of some treaties that we have with some specific countries that allow a pathway towards people filing jointly, but note that this is something that has come up, and it's on our list, of things that we would like to modify, see changed, but it is a problem, and it is not something that you want people to figure out after the fact. You want to catch this up front. Next slide, please. So options for people ineligible for insurance affordability programs due to immigration status. Next slide. So people who don't meet immigration related requirements, they could still qualify for purchasing health insurance outside of the marketplace. They could even get health insurance through an employer if their employer offers insurance. People who don't have a documented immigration status may not have a social security number, and anybody who's insured in any kind of coverage generally is going to be asked to provide a social security number, or more appropriately so, they might be asked for a broader term. They might be, the insurer might ask for a tax identification number. They do not have to provide these, and not providing them should not prevent them from enrolling or staying enrolled in coverage. People should not, lie about it. They should make sure that they're only providing numbers that are issued to them, of course. And people should, they may be asked more than once. This may end up resulting in the fact that they might have to call and say, I've gotten this notice requesting my social security number many times. We do not have that number to provide to you. That might have to happen, but people are not required to have a social security number in order to be insured. Next slide, please. So although people are ineligible to purchase marketplace coverage if they do not have a documented immigration status, they can apply for ACA health insurance for eligible family members, and they can be part of a household of eligible family members. So if a tax filer is applying for PTC on behalf of an eligible family member, they must file a tax return. And if they're not eligible for a social security number, they may file a tax return using an individual taxpayer identification number, an ITIN. It takes some time to get an ITIN, so it's important that people get that moving. Next slide, please. So Medicaid payment for services related to an emergency medical condition is available to providers to cover the cost of medical services provided to people who meet all of the state's Medicaid eligibility requirements except for immigration status. This may include people who have qualified immigration status, but they haven't met the 5-year wait that might be applicable to them, that is applicable to them. It could also be people who have a lawfully residing or lawfully present status, but they do not have a qualified immigration status. As I mentioned as an example before, it could be somebody with a temporary protected status, but there's many others. People who do not have a documented immigration status are, that's another example. Next slide, please. And then there are programs that do not restrict eligibility based off of status, and that includes some federal healthcare block grants, some mental health programs, maternal and child health, some immunizations, other programs that are public health oriented, programs providing health services necessary to protect the life and safety, emergency medical, food, shelter, mental health, crisis, domestic violence. Others, hospital financial assistance programs or charity care also are not supposed to be restricted based off of immigration status. Community health centers, federally qualified health centers, migrant health centers, also do not have immigration-related requirements for eligibility. And there are additional programs in some states that have also created pathways to coverage for people regardless of status. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it over to ISAT for questions and answers.
Thank you, Shelby, and thank you, Gabrielle. Yes, we have a good amount of questions queued up in the chat. Thank you to those who have been asking, and this is the time to put in any questions that you haven't asked so far in the chat. So we'll just get started with one here is, wasn't there a lawsuit challenging the expansion of the marketplace to DACA recipients?
Yes, there is. A number of states led by Kansas have brought that suit. There has not been any order entered. The first hearing in that case is scheduled for October 15th.
Thank you, Gabrielle. We have another question. Some states, like Washington, have waivers that allow undocumented folks to enroll into exchange and Medicaid. I think this is more so a statement, but if there's any response to that.
I just wanted to clarify that. So some states, principally Washington, Colorado has one too, it's a little different, have waivers under Section 1332 of the Affordable Care Act that allow people to enroll into their exchanges. It's not possible that we've been able to figure out anyway, to get a waiver to have undocumented people enroll in Medicaid. In states where, like California, where that's happening, the state is using its own money to pay for it.
And there are a number of states that have lookalike programs. Oftentimes we refer to them as like Medicaid lookalike programs that, again, they're using their own state dollars to fund.
Got it, thank you. We have another question that says, how many months does a person have to reside in any state to have the state residency?
There's no duration requirement on state residency. You could enter today and say that this is the state that I intend to reside in.
Thank you.
You need to have an intention to reside, or coming in for a job offer.
Thank you. We have another question here that says, some undocumented consumers do not want to apply for medical coverage to avoid deportation. Is there anything we can show them or say to make them feel safe, or is it a true possibility?
So a couple things. Remembering that health coverage in a lot of places, in most places, people who don't have a documented immigration status are not going to be eligible for Medicaid CHIP or ACA marketplace coverage. We just talked about some exceptions to that in states that have their own programs. In states, but oftentimes people are afraid to apply for coverage even for other members of their family because they're afraid that they might have to disclose the immigration status of an individual in the family that doesn't have a documented status, and that could expose them to enforce, immigration enforcement. That is a fear. That's a real fear that people have. I will say that applications are supposed to, and you all should tell me if you find one that doesn't, but applications are supposed to provide a clear pathway so that it, people who are not applying for benefits for themselves, so they're not getting coverage for themselves, they should be able to apply for everybody else in their family who wants coverage without having to disclose their immigration status at all. That helps people feel far more comfortable, right, in the application process. And it's really important to make sure that applications are not requiring people to disclose their status in any way on applications when they are not applying for themselves. Now, the question comes up in states that do have other kinds of eligibility based off of, either a waiver or the lookalike programs that are paid for by state-only dollars. Again, those application processes should be designed in a way that allows for people to provide information that can show their eligibility without having to kind of say and provide proof or evidence that they don't have a documented immigration status. That is the, the preferred mechanism, right? So in other words, somebody, when they are applying for such coverage, they can be presented a list of statuses that would satisfy the immigration related requirements for the insurance affordability programs, Medicaid CHIP, and the ACA marketplace coverage. And the person can be given the opportunity to say, I don't have one of those statuses. And that statement should be enough to be able, or I have not met the 5-year bar, right? And then keeping in mind that those programs, like the lookalikes and the waiver programs that were discussed before, they're not only for people who are undocumented. It's going to be for a lot of people who don't meet these other requirements, right? Like the 5-year bar or some of the other requirements. So depending on, different circumstances in different states. So it's not in any event, it can get tricky, but there's ways to design the programs so that they're not requiring that people lift up their hand and say, me, I'm undocumented.
Thank you, Shelby. I'm sure that was very helpful to many in the audience. We have another question. It says, for DACA, about 20% of DACA recipients in Oklahoma are under 19. What IDs or documents are they that they, sorry, let me reread. What IDs or documents they likely have that can go into a marketplace application? And this is if they do not have an employment authorization document.
Right. So when people get DACA, the way they find out about it is that they get what's called a notice of action from USCIS. I think that's Form 797. That is the document that they can present to demonstrate their DACA status.
Got it. Thank you, Gabrielle. And we have another question. Can you explain what the Refugee Medical Assistance Program is and who is eligible for it?
Gabrielle, can you take this one?
I'm not totally familiar with that program. I know that it's a limited, that when people come to the countries as refugees, they get a number of services, including refugee cash assistance and refugee medical. They're time limited, and um, it's and then after that time's out, typically they would go and apply for Medicaid.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
Thank you. We have another question. I think this will probably be our last question. For an individual who is under the federal poverty line and is not eligible for Medicaid based on their current immigration status, but is eligible for Marketplace, to enroll into Marketplace, would they have to qualify through a special enrollment event, such as getting denied from Medicaid, or would they be able to apply right away?
So if there is a special enrollment period for people, or at least there was at one point, because it was kind of in recognition that oftentimes people, it's a slow process to be able to get the right eligibility determination done for the premium tax credits for this group of individuals with incomes below 100% of the federal poverty line. I would have to go back and look to see if the SEP still is in existence. In general, people would have to enroll during either, a special enrollment period or during open enrollment for coverage. But if during like one of those periods that they were enrolling for, if they're sent to, Medicaid, or they're delayed because the Marketplace holds them, but they have to, you know, they have to verify their immigration status and all of that kind of stuff, then for sure, in that circumstance, if they've missed, now the enrollment period is over, in that case, because of the delays, then there is an SEP. What I don't know the answer to is if, like, I just came in today, and it's not, I don't have a special enrollment period. It's not open enrollment. My guess is that they don't, but if we can get back and try to find out the answer to that specific question. But again, there used to be a special enrollment period out of recognition that a lot of people, unfortunately, kind of have to take a longer process than one can imagine, because it really shouldn't be this hard. But it is. It's a challenging eligibility determination to get correct, and out of recognition for it, there was a special enrollment period. So I apologize that I don't know for sure. We'd have to look into it. Jenny, I'm not sure if you know.
No, I do not.
Yeah, so we can definitely get back to those in the chat that we didn't get to touch on during this session. Here you'll see the list of resources presented today from Beyond the Basics and NILC and other related resources. Upcoming webinars, as a reminder, we will be distributing the materials from today's session via email, and you can find it on the Beyond the Basics website. Our next webinar, as Gabrielle mentioned, is boosting enrollment among people who are immigrants and their families, outreach and application process considerations. This is scheduled for next Tuesday, September 24th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can register for this on the Beyond the Basics website at upcoming webinars. And of course, please feel free to reach out to Gabrielle, Shelby, and just the Beyond the Basics general inbox for any of your questions or any clarifying questions, and we will try our best to get back to you. Thank you, Gabrielle and Shelby, for presenting, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.